You know, usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision.
Right, yeah. Like it's a math problem.
Exactly. You think of something engineered or binary, like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, there it is. Broken or not broken, it's clean, it's visible, and frankly, it's comforting.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we rely almost entirely on that visibility in medicine. The human brain naturally wants to categorize a threat just by looking at it.
But then you step into the high-stakes microscopic world of immunohematology, the blood bank. And suddenly that x-ray machine is entirely useless. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is basically an invisible battlefield.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to describe it.
So we're taking a deep dive today into essentially a detective manual for the blood bank. A single drop of blood contains just this wealth of clues, and misinterpreting them isn't just a matter of prescribing the wrong antibiotic. It is quite literally a matter of life and death.
It is the definition of diagnostic muddy waters. But, the fascinating part is that beneath all that mud, there are these incredibly rigid physical and chemical rules governing it all.
Right.
The entire foundation of modern surgery, trauma care, oncology, it all rests on this unseen world. If the blood bank gets it wrong, everything else in the hospital just falls apart.
I really want to pull back the curtain on this for anyone listening who thinks a blood transfusion is as simple as, matching a letter and a positive or negative sign. To really understand this, we have to start with the microscopic weapons doing the fighting.
Yeah.
The immune response.
Yes, the arsenal.
Right. Because if someone receives the wrong blood, their body views it as a foreign invader. But it doesn't just blindly attack, right? It learns.
Oh, yeah. The human immune system is a remarkably sophisticated learning machine. I mean, the first time your body encounters a foreign antigen, let's say a red blood cell antigen that you don't personally possess, that triggers your primary immune response. And it is surprisingly sluggish.
Really? How sluggish?
Well, there's a lag phase, which is the time between that initial exposure and the actual production of antibodies. That can be anywhere from a few days to several months.
Days to months. I mean, if I'm sitting in a hospital bed with an infection or I just received a mismatched unit of blood, days feel like an absolute lifetime. Why does it take so long?
Because your immune system is basically starting from scratch. It has to recognize the antigen as foreign, present it to the helper T cells, activate the B cells, and then, essentially manufacture a custom-designed weapon to fit that specific target.
So it's building the factory from the ground up.
Exactly. And during this primary response, the very first antibody to roll off the assembly line is called IgM. It's the biological first responder. But it's a temporary measure. After about 2 to 3 weeks, your immune system realizes it needs a more specialized tool, so it undergoes a process called isotype switching.
Okay, isotype switching, what does that do?
It literally stops making IgM and starts producing a totally different antibody called IgG.
That feels exactly like trying to learn a highly complex physical skill. Like the first time you sit behind the wheel of a manual transmission car, it's a primary response. It's slow, it's clunky, your brain is working overtime just to figure out the clutch and the gas.
You're stalling out constantly.
Exactly. But once you learn it, the memory is locked in. So what happens the second time the body sees that exact same foreign blood cell?
That brings us to the secondary response, which is also known as the anamnestic response. And this is where the sheer power and danger of the immune system reveals itself. Because your body created memory B cells from that first encounter, there is virtually no lag phase.
None at all.
We're talking hours, not days. Muscle memory kicks in instantly.
So it doesn't bother starting with that clunky IgM first responder anymore.
Not at all. It skips the IgM phase almost entirely and instantly ramps up the production of that specialized IgG. And the antibody titer, the actual concentration of these weapons in your bloodstream, it rises significantly faster. It goes exponentially higher than it did the first time, and it stays elevated for much, much longer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is a massive logarithmic explosion of defensive power.
Meaning, if I receive an incompatible unit of blood for the very first time, my body might mount a slow, somewhat delayed attack. But if I get that same wrong blood a year later, my immune system just drops a bomb on it almost instantly.
A catastrophic bomb, which is exactly why the stakes in the blood bank are so astronomical. This perfectly sets up the two major heavyweights we need to understand, the IgM and IgG antibodies themselves. The way they behave in a patient's body, and the way a lab tech actually manipulates them in a test tube is entirely dictated by their physical structure.
Okay, let's profile these two. Looking at the data on IgM, this thing is a monster. Structurally, it's classified as a pentamer, meaning it's 5 basic Y-shaped antibody units joined together in a circle, right?
Yeah.
Which gives it a total of 10 antigen-binding sites.
10 grabbing hands, essentially. Because of that massive size and structure, IgM antibodies are often what we call naturally occurring. You don't necessarily need a prior blood transfusion or a pregnancy to develop them.
Wait, they just sort of exist in your blood naturally?
Yeah, they just exist in your plasma. They're often stimulated by ubiquitous environmental factors like bacteria or pollen that look chemically similar to certain blood group antigens.
And it has a very specific thermal preference, too. It loves the cold.
It does. Its optimum temperature of reactivity is 25 degrees Celsius or lower, room temperature, or even down to the temperature of a refrigerator. And from a purely mechanical standpoint, because it has that massive 10-armed wingspan, it reacts beautifully in a simple saline solution. It can physically reach across the microscopic distances between red blood cells in a test tube and grab them, pulling them together.
So if a lab tech is looking at a tube of blood and sees a reaction happening just sitting on the counter at room temperature, their immediate deductive thought is, okay, this is likely an IgM.
That's the exact reflex you want. But clinically speaking, IgM has 2 very defining traits. First, because it's so massive, it cannot cross the placenta. It physically cannot fit through that barrier, so it doesn't threaten a developing fetus.
Okay, that's good.
Second, with one massive exception, IgM antibodies generally do not cause severe transfusion reactions in the body.
And that exception being the ABO blood group.
Exactly. The ABO system is the grand exception to almost every rule. Your naturally occurring anti-A and anti-B antibodies are primarily IgM. And if you give type A blood to a type O person, those IgM antibodies will cause a rapid fatal reaction. But outside of the ABO system, most IgMs are considered nuisance antibodies in the lab. They just clump things up and hide the truly dangerous antibodies underneath.
So how does a tech get rid of a giant nuisance antibody so they can actually see what's hiding behind it?
Chemistry. You can destroy IgM by treating the serum with sulfhydryl compounds.
Sulfhydryl compounds.
Yeah, chemicals like dithiothyritol, known as DTT, or 2-mercaptoethanol. These chemicals act like biochemical scissors. They specifically snip the disulfide bonds that hold the 5 pieces of the pentamer together. So the IgM literally falls apart into useless fragments, and its ability to clump blood is totally destroyed.
That is brilliant. You literally dismantle the tank to see what infantry is hiding behind it.
Exactly.
And that infantry is IgG. This is the specialist. It shows up during that rapid secondary response, and structurally, it is tiny compared to IgM. It's a monomer, just a single Y-shaped with only 2 binding sites.
Right. And because it's an immune antibody, its presence usually requires a specific immunizing event. The body doesn't just make it naturally from pollen. You have to have been exposed through a prior transfusion or a pregnancy. And unlike IgM's love for the cold, IgG's optimum temperature is exactly 37 degrees Celsius.
Which is human body temperature.
Exactly. It is evolutionarily engineered to operate perfectly inside human circulation. But that tiny size creates a massive headache for the lab. Because it only has 2 binding sites and a very short wingspan, it generally cannot bridge the gap between red blood cells in a standard saline solution. It binds to the target, sure, but it can't cross-link to form a visible clump. We need special laboratory techniques to force it into the light, which we'll discuss shortly.
But the clinical stakes for IgG are terrifying, right?
They are the primary driver of delayed hemolytic transfusion reactions. Furthermore, because IgG is a tiny, sleek monomer, it crosses the placental barrier with ease. The mother's immune system can actively pump these antibodies right into the fecal circulation, which is the exact mechanism behind hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn, or HDFN.
Okay, so if I can try to synthesize this for a second. IgM is the giant, cold-loving, naturally occurring net that usually doesn't hurt you, except for an ABO mismatch. IgG is the tiny body temperature sniper that requires prior exposure, causes delayed reactions, and easily slips past the placenta.
That is the perfect framework. And understanding the physical architecture of those 2 weapons, the giant pentamer versus the tiny monomer, is the only way to understand how blood bankers actually visualize these microscopic battles.
Because that's the core problem, right? All of this is happening on a molecular level. If I'm a patient and my blood is full of rogue IgG antibodies, you can't just put my blood under a standard microscope and count them.
No, you can't.
The whole point of blood bank tube testing is to force these invisible antibodies to latch onto red blood cells and pull them together into clumps big enough to see with the naked eye. This is agglutination, and the process happens in two distinct stages.
Yes. The first stage is sensitization. This is the invisible phase. This is simply the act of the antibody recognizing its specific antigen target on the surface of the red blood cell and attaching to it. You can't see it happening, but the lab has to perfectly optimize the environment for that attachment to occur.
The sources outline four major environmental factors we have to control here. The first is temperature, which makes sense based on our profiles. If you're hunting for a dangerous IgG, you incubate the tube at 37 degrees Celsius.
Exactly.
The second is pH. These antibodies operate best in a slightly acidic to neutral environment around a pH of 5.5 to 8.5. The third is incubation time, usually 10 to 30 minutes. But the fourth factor, the antigen to antibody ratio, has a fascinating trap hidden inside it.
The prozone effect. It's a highly counterintuitive phenomenon. Logic tells us that if we want a stronger, more visible reaction, we should just add more antibodies to the tube, right?
Right, more weapons, bigger explosion.
But if you have an overwhelming excess of antibodies in the patient's serum compared to the number of red blood cells, you actually get a false negative.
Wait, how does adding more weapons result in no reaction?
Think of the red blood cell as a sphere covered in docking ports. If you flood the area with millions of antibodies, every single docking port gets occupied by a different individual antibody immediately. The entire surface of the cell is coated. Because every single site is blocked, none of those antibodies could reach out and grab a second red blood cell. They have no empty docking ports left to connect to, so they can't form bridges.
Oh, it's like a room so crowded with people that nobody can actually reach out and shake hands. Everyone's arms are just pinned to their sides.
That's a great way to visualize it. To prevent this, the optimal ratio in the test tube is rigorously maintained at 80 parts antibody to 1 part antigen. In praxis, that's usually 2 drops of patient serum to 1 drop of a 2 to 5% red blood cell suspension. That exact calibration allows just enough binding for the antibodies to link multiple cells together.
But even with the perfect ratio, we still have to deal with the liquid environment itself. Blood banking happens in saline saltwater, and apparently that saltwater actually gets in the way of sensitization.
It does. Saline is full of sodium cations and chloride anions. These free-floating ions cluster tightly around both the red blood cells and the antibodies. They create what we call an ionic cloud, a physical and electrical shield that prevents the antibody from getting close enough to the antigen to bind.
So how do we lower the shield?
We use chemical enhancers. The most common is a LISS, low ionic strength solution. By suspending the cells in LISS instead of normal saline, we drastically reduce the number of interfering sodium and chloride ions. The ionic cloud shrinks. This allows the antigens and antibodies to magnetically attract each other and interact significantly faster. It cuts incubation times in half.
Another enhancer mentioned is PEG, polyethylene glycol. How does that differ from LAS?
PEG is a macromolecule that doesn't really mess with the ions, it messes with the water. PEG intensely binds to water molecules. When you add it to the tube, it literally sucks the water out of the space between the red blood cells. By removing the water, it physically pushes the antibodies and the red blood cells into a much tighter, more concentrated space, forcing them to collide and bind.
Okay, so we've optimized the temperature, the pH, the ratio, and we've cleared away the water and the ions. The antibodies have successfully attached to the cells are sensitized, but we still haven't solved the main problem. We can't see anything. We need stage 2, agglutination, the visible clumping.
And this is where the physical limitations of our tiny IgG specialists become painfully obvious. If an IgM pentamer is attached to a cell, it has a massive reach. It easily stretches out, grabs a neighboring cell, and pulls them together. Visible clumping achieved. But the tiny IgG monomer reaches out, and it simply falls short. The neighboring cell is just too far away.
Why are the cells so far away, though? If they're just floating in a tube, shouldn't they bump into each other naturally?
They refuse to touch because of a fundamental law of physics called the zeta potential.
Let me see if I have this straight, because I absolutely love this concept. A red blood cell isn't just a neutral floating disk. The membrane is covered in specific molecules that give the entire outside of the cell a net negative electrical charge, right?
Right.
So if I have 2 red blood cells floating in a tube, they're essentially 2 negative magnets. And just like magnets, if you push 2 negative poles together, they aggressively repel each other.
That is precisely what is happening. The negative surface of the red blood cell attracts a dense layer of positive cations from the saline solution, creating a sort of positive halo around the cell. The electrical potential difference between the negative cell membrane and the outer edge of this positive halo is the zeta potential. This force ensures that in normal conditions, red blood cells will always maintain a specific physical distance from one another. They repel each other constantly.
And then the tragic irony is that the distance they repel each other to is physically wider than the wingspan of an IgG molecule. The sniper just can't reach across the gap.
Exactly.
So if the lab needs to force these negative magnets together to actually see the clump, how do we destroy the zeta potential?
We use fruit enzymes. It's an incredibly elegant biological hack. The blood bank uses enzymes like fission, which is extracted from figs, or papain, which comes from papaya.
Wait, we are pouring fig extract into human blood to change its physics.
We are. The negative charge on the red blood cell surface doesn't come from nowhere. It largely comes from a dense forest of sugar molecules called sialic acid, which stick up all over the cell membrane. When we treat the red blood cells with fission or papain, these enzymes act like a lawnmower. They physically shear the sialic acid molecules right off the surface of the cell.
You're literally shaving the negative charge right off the magnet.
Exactly. By removing the sialic acid, you drastically reduce the net negative charge. The zeta potential plummets. The repulsive force between the cells becomes incredibly weak. Now, when you centrifuge the tube, the red blood cells can be forced extremely close together. Close enough that the tiny IgG antibodies can finally reach across, grab the adjacent cell, and create the visible agglutination we need to see.
Which means reading a blood bank tube isn't just looking at clumpy blood. It's an exercise in thermodynamics, pH balancing, ratio control, and manipulating the literal electrical charge of a cell just to force an invisible war into the light.
It is, and this incredible precision is necessary because when you move out of the realm of theory and into actual patient testing, you expect these physical rules to give you a clear answer. But sometimes, despite doing everything right, the blood simply lies to you.
Let's transition into those lies. This is the realm of identity crises, ABO discrepancies, and RH typing. Let's start with the bedrock of the blood bank, Landsteiner's rule.
Carl Landsteiner discovered the ADO blood group system. And his fundamental rule is the basis of all safe transfusions. When a lab types your blood, they perform two separate tests that must perfectly mirror each other. First is the forward typing. We take your red blood cells and we drop in commercial anti-A and anti-B antibodies. We're basically asking what antigens are physically present on your cells.
So if my cells clump with anti-A, I have the A antigen. I am type A.
Exactly. Then we do the reverse typing. We take your serum, the liquid part of your blood, and we drop in known commercial A cells and B cells. We're asking what naturally occurring antibodies are floating in your plasma. Landsteiner's rule dictates that a person will always possess the antibodies against the antigens they lack. So if you are type A, your serum absolutely must clump the B cells, proving you have anti-B.
And if the forward and the reverse don't match, if my cells say I'm type A, but my serum doesn't attack type B blood,
then you have an ABO discrepancy, and the lab comes to a dead halt. You absolutely cannot issue a unit of blood to that patient until the discrepancy is solved, because one of those tests is giving you a false result.
This is pure diagnostic detective work. Our sources outline 5 classic patterns of discrepancy. Let's walk through them as medical mysteries. Pattern 1. The missing isoagglutinins. The patient's forward type says they are group O, meaning their red cells have 0 A or B antigens. Therefore, according to Landsteiner, their serum should be armed to the teeth with both anti-A and anti-B. But when you run the reverse type, the test is totally flat, negative. The antibodies are just missing. Where did they go?
This is actually the most common discrepancy we see, and it almost always points to a depressed immune system. The antibodies haven't vanished. They are just being produced at such a low titer that they can't force visible agglutination. We see this in newborns whose immune systems haven't fully booted up yet. We see it in very elderly patients whose immune function is naturally fading, and we see it in patients with severe immunodeficiencies like leukemia or those on heavy immunosuppressive drugs.
If the antibodies are just weak, how do you prove they actually exist so you can finalize the blood type?
You have to exploit the physical weaknesses of the antibody. Remember, anti-A and anti-B are primarily IgM antibodies, and IgM loves the cold. So you take the reverse grouping tubes and you incubate them at room temperature for 30 minutes. If they're still negative, you push harder, you put them in the refrigerator at exactly 4 degrees Celsius. This severe drop in temperature alters the thermodynamics of the binding, heavily favoring the IgM, forcing even a tiny amount of antibody to strongly agglutinate the cells.
But doesn't freezing blood make everything clump up naturally anyway?
It can. That's why you must run an autologous control alongside it. You mix the patient's own red cells with their own serum and put that in the fridge too. If the patient's own blood clumps with itself, The cold is just causing a non-specific artifact and your test is invalid. If the autocontrol stays smooth, but the reverse typing clumps, you've solved it.
Brilliant use of the environment. Let's look at pattern 2. A patient types as group A in the forward, but in the reverse, their serum attacks the A1 regent cells, meaning this type A person is producing an antibody against type A blood. How is it biologically possible?
This requires understanding that blood groups aren't monoliths. The A blood group is actually divided into subgroups. About 80% of group A individuals are the A1 subgroup. Their red cells are absolutely packed with complex A1 antigens. The remaining 20% are the A2 subgroup. Their A antigens have a slightly different chemical structure, and there are far fewer of them on the cell surface.
So the immune system of an A2 person looks at a standard A1 blood cell and says, that chemical structure is slightly different than mine, that's a foreign threat, and they develop an anti-A1 antibody.
Exactly. They are technically type A, but they will aggressively attack the most common type of type A blood. To resolve this, the lab has to definitively prove the patient is that rare A2 subgroup. And we do this using a fascinating reagent called Dolichos biflorus lectin.
A lectin. We are bringing plant biology into the blood bank again.
It's incredible. Lectins are proteins found in plant seeds that have an uncanny ability to bind to specific human blood sugars. The extract from the Dolichos biflorus seed, which is the horsegram plant, will aggressively clump A1 red blood cells, but it completely ignores A2 red blood cells. If we test the patient's cells with this plant extract and nothing happens, we've proven they are an A2 subgroup.
Solving human immune mysteries with horsegram seeds. I love it. All right, pattern 3.
Rouleau. The tech looks at the test tube, and it looks like a massive positive reaction. Both the forward and reverse types are clumping everywhere. But when you look under the microscope, the red blood cells look like stacks of coins glued together in long chains.
Rouleau is a dangerous illusion. It looks like agglutination, but it has absolutely nothing to do with antibodies. It's a purely physical phenomenon driven by a massive overabundance of heavy proteins in the patient's plasma. We classically see this in patients with multiple myeloma, a cancer of the plasma cells, or severe liver disease.
How do heavy proteins cause the cells to stack up like that?
Remember the zeta potential, that negative repulsive force keeping the cells apart. The massive influx of heavy, positively charged proteins from the cancer floods the plasma. These proteins coat the red blood cells, neutralizing that negative charge. Without the repulsive force, the flat, disc-like shape of the red blood cells causes them to naturally stick flat against each other, stacking up like coins.
So if it's just cancer proteins causing the stacking, how do you get rid of them to see the actual blood type?
For the forward typing, it's straightforward. You take the patient's red blood cells and you physically wash them 3 or 4 times with large volumes of saline. This flushes all the cancerous plasma proteins down the drain. You are left with clean, uncoated red cells. You can test them normally.
But you can't wash the serum for the reverse type, right? Because the serum is what you're testing. If you wash it, you wash away the antibodies you're looking for.
Correct. For the reverse type, we use a saline replacement technique. You mix the patient's heavy serum with the reagent red cells and let them sit so the antibodies have time to attach. Then you centrifuge the tube, so all the cells pack tightly at the bottom. Very carefully, you use a pipette to suck out all the heavy protein serum from the top, and you replace it with pure, clean saline. You gently shake the tube. If it was true antibody agglutination, the clump holds together. If it was just Rouleau stacking, the clean saline disperses the proteins, and the coins instantly fall apart.
That is such a clever mechanical workaround. Okay, let's move to pattern 4. The patient types as AB forward, but their reverse typing shows they're reacting to things they shouldn't at room temperature. The sources call this an unexpected cold allowing-body.
Right. The patient has a completely separate, naturally occurring cold antibody like an anti-M or an anti-P1 that is totally unrelated to the ABO system. But because the commercial A and B cells used in the reverse typing also happen to have M or P1 antigens on them, the patient's cold antibody attacks them, creating a false positive in the ABO test.
So you have to identify the rogue antibody first by running a full panel, and once you figure out it's anti-M, you just repeat the ABO reverse typing using special A and B cells that lack the M antigen. You just remove the target.
Exactly. You just clear the battlefield of distractions.
Which brings us to the grand finale of discrepancies, pattern 5. Acquired B. I find this one absolutely staggering. A patient's forward type says they are AB. They have both A and B antigens. But their reverse type says they are A, meaning their serum contains anti-B. This completely violates Landsteiner's rule. Why would a patient have a massive amount of anti-B circulating in their plasma if their own cells are supposedly covered in the B antigen? The anti-B should be destroying their own blood.
It should, but it isn't, because the B antigen on their cells is a phantom. It is a complete illusion. This phenomenon, acquired B, almost exclusively occurs in patients suffering from a severe gastrointestinal catastrophe like advanced colon cancer, a massive intestinal obstruction, or septicemia.
Wait, are you telling me gut bacteria are altering their blood type?
Yes. The A antigen on a red blood cell is defined by a very specific sugar called N-acetylgalactosamine. Certain strains of gut bacteria produce massive amounts of an enzyme called deacetylase. If the patient's colon ruptures or they become septic, these bacterial enzymes flood into the bloodstream. When they encounter the patient's type A red blood cells, the enzyme literally acts like a pair of biochemical scissors. It shears the acetyl group right off the N-acetylgalactosamine sugar.
Altering the chemical structure entirely.
Right. It converts it to galactosamine. And galactosamine looks chemically almost identical to D-galactose, which is the defining sugar for the B antigen. It is a biological heist. The bacteria have disguised the A antigen to look like a B antigen. So when the lab drops a commercial anti-B into the tube, the reagent gets confused, binds to the fake sugar, and gives a false positive AB reading.
The idea that a bacterial infection in your colon can temporarily disguise your blood type from a laboratory test? It's terrifying. If you suspect an acquired B, how do you definitively prove it?
Well, first, you look at the patient's chart. Are they in the ICU with a bowel issue? Then, you exploit the slight chemical difference between the true B sugar and the fake bacterial sugar. You retype their cells using a very specific reagent. Acidified human anti-B, calibrated to a pH of 6.0. A true genetic B antigen is robust. It will still strongly react at this acidic pH. But the fake acquired B antigen is structurally weak. The acid prevents it from binding. The reaction disappears, proving it was an illusion.
That perfectly highlights why this field is so demanding. You aren't just reading tubes, you're reading the patient's entire pathology. So we've solved the ABO crises. But ABO is only half the equation when we talk about a blood type. We have to talk about Rh. When someone says they are O positive, the positive refers to the D antigen in the Rh system. You either have it or you don't. What are the nuances of typing for D?
Historically, it was incredibly fraught. Labs used to rely on high-protein anti-D reagents. This is a thick, heavy mixture of IgG and IgM antibodies suspended in a dense protein base, often bovine albumin. Because it was so heavy and sticky, it drastically reduced the zeta potential on its own.
Which sounds helpful until you realize it might make everything clump together.
Precisely. It was notorious for causing false positives, especially if the patient's cells were already lightly coated with their own antibodies. Because of this high false positive rate, using high-protein anti-D mandated the use of a separate Rh control tube, essentially just the thick protein base without the anti-D. If your control tube clumped, your actual test was completely invalid. You couldn't trust it.
But modern labs have largely moved away from that, right? The sources highlight low-protein anti-D.
Yes. The advent of monoclonal antibodies changed everything. Today, we use a manufactured blend of monoclonal IgM and IgG anti-D, formulated in a much thinner, low-protein medium. It doesn't cause that spontaneous, sticky clumping. It's so accurate that you generally don't even need to run a control tube anymore unless the patient types as AB positive.
Why AB positive?
Because if a patient types as AB positive, it means every single forward typing tube, anti-A, anti-B, and anti-D showed agglutination. When literally everything clumps, a good scientist gets suspicious. You run a saline control just to ensure the patient's blood isn't just spontaneously agglutinating with everything it touches due to a cold autoantibody or rouleau.
Makes sense. Now, what causes a false negative in Rh typing? We've talked about false positives from sticky proteins, but how could someone actually have the D antigen and the test misses it?
Human error is a big one. If the tech shakes the tube too violently and literally shatters the delicate agglutination before reading it. But the most terrifying cause of a false negative happens in newborns suffering from severe hemolytic disease. The baby is genetically Rh positive, but the mother's anti-D antibodies have crossed the placenta and completely saturated every single D antigen site on the baby's red blood cell.
Oh, it's the prozone effect happening inside the baby's body.
Exactly. Every docking port is taken. When the lab draws the baby's blood and adds commercial anti-D, the region has nowhere to bind. It washes right off. The baby types as Rh negative, which is a lethal false negative if the doctor doesn't realize the cells are entirely blocked by maternal antibody.
Wow. Now, what happens if an adult donor or a baby born to an Rh-negative mother initially types as Rh-negative in the standard tube test? Are we completely done? Do we label them Rh-negative?
Absolutely not. You must perform weak D testing. Some individuals genetically possess the D antigen, but it is very weakly expressed. Maybe they only have a few hundred antigen sites per cell instead of thousands, or the physical shape of the D protein is slightly mutated.
So the antibody can't grab it easily.
Right. So if the initial test at room temperature is negative, you take that exact same tube and you incubate it at 37 degrees Celsius for up to an hour. This gives the antibodies maximum opportunity to find those rare hidden D antigens. Then you wash the cells and carry the test all the way through the anti-human globulin, the AHG phase, which we'll discuss in depth. If it finally clumps at the AG phase, they are classified as weak D positive.
Why does this distinction matter so much? Let's break down the real-world selection criteria for a transfusion. If I am a standard Rh positive patient,
You can safely receive either Rh positive or Rh negative blood. Your body recognizes the D antigen, so getting more of it is fine, and getting blood without it is also fine.
but if I am Rh negative,
You must receive Rh negative blood only. If we give you Rh positive blood, your immune system will recognize the D antigen as foreign, and you will manufacture a potent anti-D IgG antibody. This rule is absolute, and it's critically enforced for women of childbearing age, because if a woman forms anti-D, it will violently attack any future Rh positive pregnancy she might have.
okay, let me give you a high-stakes scenario. It's midnight in the ER, a massive multi-vehicle trauma rolls in. A 30-year-old man, Rh negative, is bleeding out. The hospital's blood bank is completely depleted of O negative blood. To save his life tonight, you have to give him O positive blood. You are deliberately injecting the antigen he is going to attack. What do you do?
It is a calculated, desperate risk to save a life. You pump the O positive blood to stop him from bleeding to death. His immune system is going to start learning, preparing that primary response to build anti-D. To prevent that, as soon as he is stabilized, the blood bank can administer massive doses of Rh immune globulin. This is an injection of pre-made anti-D. The goal is for the injected Rhig to hunt down and destroy all those donor Rh positive cells in his circulation before his own immune system gets a chance to recognize them and memorize the threat.
We'll dive deep into Rhig later, but that highlights the absolute tightrope blood bankers walk. And what if I am that weak D person, the one who only clumped at the very final stage of testing?
The rules for weak D are fascinatingly asymmetric. If you are a recipient needing blood, hospitals treat you as Rh positive. You can safely receive Rh positive blood because you possess the D antigen, even weakly. But if you are a blood donor and you type as weak D, your unit of blood is strictly labeled as Rh positive, because even that weak mutated D antigen is enough to trigger a severe immune response in an Rh negative recipient.
So you are positive enough to donate as positive and positive enough to receive positive. Okay, so we've covered ABO and Rh. Those are the famous ones. But the blood bank world is full of other significantly trickier rogue antibodies. This brings us to profiling the suspects. The sources provide a dense list of antibody characteristics because every single blood group system has a distinct personality, a distinct thermal preference, and a distinct method of attack. Let's do a rapid-fire profiling. First category, naturally occurring antibodies, the ones you don't need a transfusion to build.
These are almost universally your bulky IgM pentamers. We already know ABO is the king of this category. But the other prime suspects are the Lewis system, P1, the MN antigens, and Lua, which is Lutheran A. Because they are IgM, they generally react at room temperature and are often ignored unless they cause a discrepancy.
Next category, the clinically significant antibodies, the killers.
These are the IgGs. They will destroy transfused red cells and they will cross the placenta. ABO is still on this list because of its sheer ferocity, but the major immune suspects are Rh, Kell, Duffy, KID, and the SSU system. If a patient has any of these, the lab must rigorously hunt down donor blood that completely lacks these antigens.
And their thermal preferences map perfectly to their structures. The warm-reacting antibodies, the IgGs operating at 37 degrees body temperature, are Rh, Kell, Duffy, and KID. The cold-reacting IgMs are M, N, and P1. Now let's talk about enzymes again. Earlier, we said fian and papain act like lawnmowers, shaving off the negative sialic acid charge to enhance agglutination. But the sources note that these enzymes don't just change the electrical charge, they physically obliterate certain antigens completely.
Yes, this is a crucial tool for the detective. The structural proteins that make up the N and Duffy antigens, specifically Phi and Phoebe, as well as the SNS antigens, are highly fragile. They sit exactly where the enzyme lawnmower cuts. If you treat a red blood cell with Flacine, those specific antigens are sheared off and destroyed completely.
So if I'm a lab tech and I have a mystery antibody in a tube reacting at 37 degrees and I can't figure out what it is, I repeat the test using red cells that have been treated with Ficin. If the reaction completely vanishes, I instantly know my suspect was attacking Duffy or S's because I just mowed their targets off the field.
Exactly. It's a phenomenally powerful process of elimination. Conversely, treating cells with enzymes actually enhances the reactions of Rh, Lewis, KID, and PO1 antibodies. By removing the steric hindrance of the sialic acid, the enzymes fully expose these deeper antigens, making the reactions much stronger.
Let's talk about a genetic nuance mentioned in the sources, the dosage effect. Some antibodies react stronger with homozygous cells than heterozygous cells. How does genetics play into a test tube reaction?
It's all about antigen density. Remember basic genetics.
Yeah.
You inherit one gene from your mother, one from your father. Let's look at the KID system, which has two main antigens, JAKAs and JAKA-B. If you inherit the JAKA gene from both parents, you are homozygous. Your red blood cells will be absolutely plastered with a double dose of the JASIC antigen.
Right, because there's no competition for space.
Right. But if you inherit JAKA from your mom and JAKA-B from your dad, you are heterozygous. Your red cells have to split the real estate. They have half as many JAKA antigens and half as many JAKA-B antigens. Certain antibodies, specifically Rh of D, MNS, Duffy, and KID, are highly sensitive to this density. They will react violently with a homozygous cell, showing strong agglutination. But they will react very weakly, or sometimes show a false negative entirely when tested against a heterozygous cell that only has a single dose.
That is a terrifying trap for a lab tech. If you only test against a heterozygous cell, you might think the patient is safe when they actually have a deadly antibody lurking. Let's talk about notoriety. There are some specific bad actors here. The KID system. Our sources call KID antibodies labile. What does that mean practically?
It means they are masters of hiding. KID antibodies, anti-JAKA and anti-JAKA-B, are notorious for fighting incredibly quickly. A patient might receive a transfusion, develop a KID antibody, and have a mild reaction. But a few months later, the antibody titer in their bloodstream drops so profoundly low that it becomes undetectable on a standard lab screen.
It drops below the radar.
Yes.
Yeah.
So a year later, they need another transfusion. The lab runs an antibody screen, it comes up perfectly negative, and they transfuse KID-positive blood. Because it's an IgG, the patient's immune system instantly recognizes the threat, the memory B cells wake up, and you get a massive secondary anamnestic response. The antibody titer explodes overnight, and the patient suffers a severe delayed hemolytic transfusion reaction days after the surgery. KID is the classic culprit for this specific disaster.
What about complement binders, the ones that don't just tag cells for removal, but actively rip holes in them?
The complement cascade is a series of proteins in the blood that, when activated by certain antibodies, assemble into a drill-like structure called a membrane attack complex. It literally punches a physical hole in the red blood cell membrane, causing it to burst. Lewis KID and the I system strongly bind complement, and some can cause such severe rapid destruction that they cause in vitro hemolysis, literally turning the liquid in the test tube pink because they've burst all the red cells before you even read the test. ABO, Lewis, KID, VEL, and some P1 antibodies do this.
The sources also list some very specific, highly tested disease associations. Let's unpack the why behind them. Anti-P is strongly associated with paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, or PCH. What is happening there?
PCH is a fascinating, terrifying autoimmune disease. It's driven by a biphasic IgG antibody against the P antigen. Biphasic means it requires two different temperatures to do its damage. When the patient goes out into the cold, the temperature in their extremities drops. In this cold environment, the anti-P antibody binds to their red blood cells, but it doesn't destroy them yet. When the patient comes back inside and warms up, the antibody activates the complement cascade at body temperature, causing massive intravascular hemolysis. Their red cells burst, and they urinate dark, hemoglobin-filled urine.
So the cold primes the bomb, and the warmth detonates it. Another disease association. Anti-I is classically associated with infectious mononucleosis. Why does a viral infection trigger a specific blood antibody?
This requires understanding a developmental nuance. The I system antigens change as you grow. When a fetus is developing, its red blood cells are packed with a little eye antigen. Over the first 18 months of life, a genetic switch flips, and that little eye structurally converts into the big eye antigen. So adult cells have tons of big eye and almost no little eye. Cord blood cells are the exact opposite.
Okay, so how does mono fit into this?
Infectious mononucleosis is caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. This virus actively infects B cells, the very cells that make antibodies. The virus essentially scrambles the immune system's targeting programming. It causes the B cells to produce an autoantibody that specifically attacks that rare, hidden little eye antigen that is still present in trace amounts on adult cells.
So the virus temporarily forces your immune system to attack a ghost from its developmental past. And if a lab tech has a mystery antibody that reacts violently with adult cells, but is totally negative against cord blood cells, they know instantly it's an anti-eye, the adult version.
Exactly. The differential reactivity between adult and cord cells is the diagnostic hallmark.
Okay, we know the suspects, we know their habits and their thermal preferences. Now we have to talk about the detective's primary tool for actually finding these hidden IgG snipers. We mentioned earlier that IgG is too small to overcome the zeta potential. How do we build a bridge?
We use antihuman globulin, AHG, also historically known as the Coombs reagent. It is an ingenious piece of immunology. Since human IgG is too small to reach across the gap between red cells, scientists realized we needed a secondary connector. So they injected human IgG antibodies into animals, originally rabbits. The rabbit immune system looked at the human IgG, recognized it as a foreign protein, and manufactured a large rabbit antibody specifically designed to grab the base of the human IgG.
An antibody against an antibody.
Exactly. We harvest those rabbit antibodies, and that is our AHG reagent. In the lab, you mix the patient's serum with reagent red cells and incubate them at 37 degrees. The tiny human IgDs attach to the red cells. Then, crucially, you wash the cells thoroughly with saline.
Why the washing step? Why not just dump the AHG right in?
Because AHG binds to any human antibody.
Yeah.
If you don't wash the cells, the plasma is still full of millions of free-floating human antibodies that never attach to a red cell. If you add the AHG, it will instantly bind to all the free-floating garbage in the liquid, neutralizing the reagent before it ever reaches the red cells.
Oh, so you wash away everything that isn't physically bolted down to a red cell membrane?
Yes. Once the cells are washed clean, you add the AHG drops. The massive AHG molecule attaches to the tail end of one human IgG on one cell and stretches across to grab the tail end of another human IgG on a neighboring cell. It physically bridges the gap that the human IgG couldn't cross. Visible agglutination is achieved.
And there are two main flavors of this AHG reagent, polyspecific and monospecific.
Right. Polyspecific AHG is a broad-spectrum net. It is a blend that contains antibodies against human IgG and also antibodies against human complement proteins, specifically C3. It catches almost any immune activity. Monospecific AHG is highly targeted. It contains only anti-IgG or only anti-C3.
The sources outline two fundamentally different tests that utilize this AHG reagent, the DATE and the IAT. This is a crucial distinction. Let's make this crystal clear. The DATE is the direct antiglobulin test.
The DAT is designed to detect in vivo sensitization. It is answering one very specific question. Did this patient's antibodies attach to their red blood cells inside their own body while the blood was still in their veins before we ever drew the sample?
So because the attack already happened in the body, there is no incubation step in the lab.
Correct. You don't need to add anything to attach the antibodies. You just take the patient's red cells straight from the tube, wash them to remove the free proteins, and add the AHG directly. If it clumps, the test is positive. The cells were coated internally.
Why do we specifically use an EDTA whole blood tube, the purple top tube, for a DAT?
EDTA is a chelating agent. It violently binds up all the calcium in the blood sample. Calcium is absolutely required for the complement cascade to activate. By removing the calcium, EDTA instantly freezes any complement activity the moment the blood enters the tube. This ensures that if we detect complement on the red cells during a DAT, we know with absolute certainty the complement attached inside the patient's body and isn't just a false positive artifact from the blood sitting in a cold tube on a lab bench.
Makes sense. And we use the DET to investigate severe internal events. Hemolytic disease of the newborn, transfusion reactions, and autoimmune hemolytic anemias. Now contrast that with the IAT, the indirect antiglobulin test.
The IAT detects in vitro sensitization. It is predictive. It answers the question, if we mix this patient's serum with these specific donor red cells in a test tube, will they attack each other? Because we are forcing the interaction outside the body, the IAT mandates an incubation period. We mix the serum and cells, put them in a 37-degree water bath for 15 to 30 minutes to allow the tiny IgGs to find their targets. Then we wash,
And then we add the AHG.
The IAT is the workhorse of the lab. We use it for routine antibody screens and cross-matches. But AHG testing is incredibly prone to human error, isn't it? The false negative list here is long and terrifying.
It is a delicate procedure. As we discussed, the most dangerous error is inadequate washing. If you leave even a microscopic trace of free-floating plasma protein in the tube, it will neutralize the AHT region instantly, giving you a false negative. The patient could have a lethal antibody, but the tube looks smooth.
Other false negatives include simply forgetting to add the AHG drops, which happens when you're processing 50 tubes at 2 a.m. or delaying the reading, or under centrifugation. So how does the lab prove the test actually worked?
Every single time a lab tech gets a negative AHG result, they must add check cells to the tube. These are commercially prepared red blood cells that have been pre-coated with human IgG. You drop them into your negative tube and spin it again. If the check cells agglutinate, it proves that active working AHG was present in the tube. If the check cells do not agglutinate, it means your AHG was either forgotten or it was neutralized by poor washing. The original negative result is totally invalid, and you must start the entire test over.
That built-in failsafe is incredibly reassuring. Okay, let's put this entire detective toolkit to use. We have a patient. Their routine IAT antibody screen comes back positive. They have a rogue, dangerous IgG antibody circulating in their plasma. How do we figure out exactly which of the dozens of possible suspects it is? This is the art of interpreting antibody panels.
Right. We use a logic puzzle technique called the rule-out method. The lab orders an antibody panel. This comes with a set of 10 to 20 different reagent red blood cells, each in its own tiny vial. And it comes with a master sheet, a grid, that maps out exactly which antigens are present on every single one of those numbered cells. You test the patient's serum against all 11 cells individually, taking them entirely through the 37-degree incubation and AHG phases.
This is exactly like playing a massive game of Guess Who.
Yeah.
You have a board of 24 faces, and you ask, does your person have glasses? If the answer is no, you physically flip down every single face that has glasses. You are eliminating suspects based on traits they don't possess.
That analogy is perfect. In the blood bank, you look at your row of test tubes. You find a tube that did not react with the patient's serum. It stayed smooth. Since there was zero reaction, you know with certainty that the patient does not have antibodies against any of the antigens present on that specific cell.
Right.
So you go to your master grid, look at the column for that negative cell, and you physically cross out every single antigen it possesses.
Let me walk through that to be sure. If the patient had a deadly anti-K antibody and cell number 3 possesses the K antigen, cell number 3 should have clumped violently. But cell number 3 is negative. Therefore, the antibody cannot possibly be anti-K. Anti-K is ruled out. Flip the face down.
Precisely. You methodically do this for every single negative reaction on your panel. Eventually, you cross out almost the entire alphabet of antigens. You circle the very few antigens that are left uncrossed. Those are your remaining suspects. Then you look at the reaction pattern. If the patient's serum only agglutinated with cell 4 and cell 7, and the only uncrossed antigen present on both cell 4 and cell 7 is the big E antigen, you've found your culprit, anti-E.
But wait! We have to bring the genetic dosage effect back into this. The fact that some antibodies, like KIT or R only, react strongly with homozygous cells, cells with a double dose of the antigen. How does that ruin the rule-out method?
It makes it a minefield. Blood bankers are trained to only cross out an antigen if the negative cell is homozygous for that specific trait. Why? Because if you try to rule out anti-JACA using a heterozygous cell, you might be making a fatal error. The patient might actually possess a weak antibody, but it was just too weak to react with a single dose of antigen on that heterozygous cell. It gave a false negative. If you cross JACA off your suspect list based on that weak reaction, you will miss the true killer. So you must use robust homozygous cells to confidently rule things out.
And once you stare at the grid and you confidently deduce, I think it's anti-E, how do you mathematically confirm? You can't just guess.
You need statistical confidence.
Yeah.
The standard protocol requires testing a sufficient number of cells to achieve a probability value, or p-value, of 0.05. That translates to a 95% confidence level that your identification is not just a random coincidence. To achieve this, you need the reactions to perfectly match at least 3 cells that are positive for the E antigen and 3 cells that are entirely negative for it.
Oh, the 3 and 3 rule.
Right. If the 3 positive cells clump and the 3 negative cells stay smooth, you've hit statistical significance. And the very final step of the investigation, you take the patient's own red blood cells and you type them for the E antigen. They must be negative for it because you cannot produce an antibody against a protein that naturally exists on your own body. If they type positive for E,
your entire investigation is wrong, and you're likely dealing with an autoantibody.
It is an unbelievably rigorous process, which we desperately need because it leads us to part 5, the final showdown, cross-matches. This is the absolute last hurdle, the final safety check before a bag of donor blood is physically hung on an IV pole and infused into a patient's arm.
The cross-match is the ultimate proof of compatibility, and the rigor of the cross-match depends entirely on the patient's historical and current antibody status. We have 3 main types.
Let's start with the most thorough, the most exhaustive, the antiglobulin cross-match.
You must use the full antiglobulin cross-match if the patient currently has a clinically significant antibody, or if their medical record shows they have ever had one in the past, even if the titer has currently dropped below detectable levels. You take the patient's serum and you mix it directly with a small sample of the actual red blood cells taken from the specific donor bag. You incubate that tube at 37 degrees, you wash it, and you add AHG. You force the worst-case scenario in the tube. It must be perfectly negative at the AHG phase to be issued.
But what if the patient is totally clean? Like, it's a healthy guy having a routine knee replacement. He has no history of antibodies, and his current IAT screen is totally negative.
But you don't need to put him through the massive AHG process. You only perform an immediate spin, or IS cross-match. You simply mix the recipient serum with the donor cells, immediately spin it in the centrifuge at room temperature, and read it. You do not incubate it, and you do not add AHG.
Wait, if I'm the patient, I want the most rigorous test possible. Isn't skipping the AHG phase riskier?
It isn't, because the comprehensive antibody screen you already ran mathematically proved that you don't possess any dangerous IgG antibodies. Running the cross-match through AHG would be redundant. The only purpose of the immediate spin cross-match is a final, rapid check for a catastrophic ABO incompatibility, because anti-A and anti-B are IgM antibodies, and they will violently agglutinate immediately at room temperature.
And some advanced hospitals don't even use test tubes for clean patients anymore. They use the computer or electronic cross-match.
Yes. If the hospital's computer system is rigorously validated by the FDA, and the patient has 2 completely separate ABO typings on file to rule out a clerical draw error, and their current antibody screen is negative, the computer algorithm just checks the barcode of the donor unit against the patient's electronic file. If it matches, the computer clears the blood for release instantly. No physical mixing required.
Let's talk about the philosophical limits of the major cross-match mixing patient serum with donor cells. What exactly will it do for the patient?
It will detect an ABO incompatibility, preventing an immediate fatal reaction. And it will detect most antibodies in the patient's serum that are directed against antigens on those specific donor cells.
But what will it not do?
It will not detect a minor RH time. Error giving an RH-positive unit to a weak D patient might look compatible in the tube. It will not detect an antibody if the patient's titer has dropped below the threshold of the AHG reagent. Crucially, a compatible cross-match will not prevent the patient from becoming immunized to a completely new antigen they are receiving. And it absolutely does not guarantee that the transfused red cells will survive normally in the patient's body.
Let's pause on that. If I'm rushed to the ER and they give me O-negative blood, the supposed universal donor blood, and the cross-match is compatible, you're telling me I could still have a massive reaction. If it doesn't guarantee the blood survives, why is it considered the gold standard of safety?
Because medicine is never about perfect, absolute guarantees. It is about catastrophic risk reduction. The cross-match is designed to catch the immediate, life-threatening incompatibilities, the massive ABO mismatches, and the strong, established IgGs. It ensures the patient survives the surgery today. It cannot predict the microscopic, nuanced ways your unique immune system might decide to attack a minor antigen 3 weeks from now.
Let's walk through some real-world scenarios of an incompatible cross-match. The tech pulls the tube from the centrifuge, holds it up to the mirror, and it's clumping. The cross-match failed. What does it mean? Scenario 1. The patient's antibody screen was perfectly negative, but the immediate spin cross-match against the donor unit is violently clumping.
That is almost certainly a catastrophic ABO incompatibility. Someone grabbed a type A unit from the fridge for a type O patient, or the phlebotomist drew the wrong patient's blood. The tech must stop everything and immediately retype both the donor and the recipient from scratch.
Scenario 2. The antibody screen shows one cell is positive at the AHG phase, and when you cross-match 4 donor units, one of the 4 units clumps at AHG.
You are dealing with a classic new alone antibody. The patient has developed an IgG against a specific antigen. You must perform the full rule-out panel we discussed, identify exactly what the antibody is, say anti-Kel, and then physically screen your hospital's blood supply to find donor units that are negative for the Kel antigen.
Scenario 3. The patient's antibody screen is perfectly clean, but one of the donor units is positive at the AHG phase.
Logic dictates that if the screen is totally negative, the patient doesn't possess a rogue antibody. Therefore, the problem isn't the patient. The problem is the donor bag. The red cells in that specific donor bag likely have a positive DAT. The donor had an autoimmune issue, and their red cells were already coated with IgG before they even walked into the blood center to donate. You perform a DAT on the donor unit to confirm, and if it's positive, you quarantine it and return it to the supplier. It cannot be used.
Scenario 4. This is the nightmare. Everything is clumping. The entire antibody screen is positive at AHG. Every single donor unit you cross-match is positive. And crucially, the patient's auto-control their serum against their own cells is violently positive.
The positive autocontrol is the smoking gun. The patient is experiencing a severe autoimmune crisis. They have developed a warm autoantibody that is indiscriminately attacking a core foundational protein present on all human red blood cells. It masks any true low antibodies because it reacts with literally everything. If transfusion is completely unavoidable because their hemoglobin is critically low, the physician must sign a waiver to authorize releasing the least incompatible unit, knowing full well the patient's body will actively destroy the blood. We're just trying to buy them a few more hours of oxygen delivery.
Scenario 5. Everything's positive at the 37-degree incubation, but when you watch the cells and read the AHG phase, the clumping entirely disappears.
Remember the stacked coins, this is low. The heavy cancer proteins cause pseudoagglutination during the 37-degree incubation. But when you vigorously wash the cells with saline to perform the AHG test, you flush all those heavy proteins away. The stacking collapses, and the AHG phase reads as a true negative.
This brings us to the stark reality of the job. Part 6. The fallout. Because despite all this rigorous testing, the rule-outs, the enzymes, the cross-matches, mistakes happen. Clerical errors happen. Or biology simply finds a way to subvert the test. Transfusion reactions. We categorize these strictly by time. Acute reactions happen within 24 hours, delayed reactions happen after 24 hours, and we divide them by mechanism. Immunologic versus non-immunologic. Let's start with the most feared dramatic event in the hospital. Acute immunologic reactions, specifically the hemolytic intravascular reaction.
This is the absolute worst-case scenario. It is frequently fatal, and it is almost universally caused by a human clerical error, resulting in an ABO mismatch like giving type A blood to a type O patient. The patient's pre-existing massive titer of IgM anti-A instantly attacks the donor red cells while they're still circulating in the blood vessels intravascularly. The IgM immediately activates the complement cascade. Millions of membrane attack complexes drill holes into the donor red cells simultaneously, causing them to explode directly in the bloodstream.
The clinical presentation of this is violent. Fever, severe shock, and DIC. What exactly is DIC?
Disseminated intravascular coagulation. When millions of red blood cells explode, they dump all their internal debris and toxic hemoglobin directly into the plasma. The body panics at the sight of this debris and triggers a massive systemic clotting response. The patient's blood forms thousands of microscopic clots everywhere, using up all of the body's platelets and clotting factors in minutes. Because the clotting factors are depleted, the patient simultaneously begins bleeding out from every IV site, wound, and mucous membrane. They are clotting and hemorrhaging at the exact same time.
And the pain in the lower back? I read that's a symptom.
Yes. That flank pain is the sensation of the kidneys physically shutting down. The massive protein load of free hemoglobin from the burst cells clogs the delicate filtration tubules of the kidneys, causing acute renal failure. If you draw the patient's blood post-reaction and spin it down, the serum won't be straw-colored. It will be bright cherry red or pink from the free hemoglobin.
That is the ultimate nightmare. But a much more common acute immunologic reaction is the febrile reaction, right?
Yes, far less severe. The patient experiences a sudden 1 degree Celsius spike in temperature during or shortly after the transfusion, often with chills. This isn't an attack on red blood cells. It's usually caused by the patient possessing antibodies against donor white blood cells leukocytes. Or it's a reaction to inflammatory cytokines that naturally built up in the bag of blood while it was sitting in the refrigerator. We largely prevent this today by using leukoreduced components, running the blood through a microscopic filter to remove the white blood cells before it ever goes into storage.
Next is the allergic reaction. Hives, urticaria, mild wheezing.
This is a standard allergic histamine response. The patient's immune system is reacting to foreign plasma proteins suspended in the donor unit. It's common, usually mild, and you treat it just like any other allergy with antihistamines like Benadryl. It rarely requires a massive blood bank investigation.
But the anaphylactic reaction is a completely different beast.
It is rare, but instantly life-threatening. This specific reaction occurs in patients who suffer from a severe genetic deficiency in IgA antibodies. Because their body has never produced IgA, their immune system views the normal IgA plasma proteins present in a donor unit as a massive, hostile, foreign threat. Within drops of the blood entering their vein, they launch an anaphylactic attack. They develop severe bronchospasms, their airway swells, and they go into cardiovascular collapse. You must treat them instantly with epinephrine. To prevent this, these specific patients must only receive blood that has been extensively washed with saline to remove every microscopic drop of donor plasma.
Let's talk about TRIAL-I, transfusion-related acute lung injury. The sources explicitly note this is the leading cause of transfusion-related death in the United States today.
TRIAL-I is brutal and terrifying. Within 6 hours of a transfusion, a seemingly stable patient develops severe, sudden respiratory distress. Their lungs rapidly fill with fluid, causing non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. They are literally drowning from the inside.
What causes it? It's not a red blood cell attack, right?
No, the mechanism is essentially the reverse of a normal reaction. The donor's plasma contains powerful HLA antibodies that attack the recipient's white blood cells. These attacked white blood cells clump together and become physically trapped in the microscopic capillary beds of the recipient's lungs. They release toxic enzymes that destroy the lung tissue, causing plasma to leak into the air sacs.
And the blood banking community discovered a massive demographic link that helped prevent this.
Yes, a vital piece of epidemiology. We discovered that these specific, highly destructive HLA antibodies are almost exclusively formed by women who have had multiple pregnancies, multiparous women. During pregnancy, the mother is exposed to the father's foreign white blood cell antigens present in the fetus, and she builds antibodies against them. To drastically reduce TRIAL-I fatalities, modern blood banks implemented a policy to primarily use plasma donated by men or women who have never been pregnant.
Shifting to acute non-immunologic reactions, these aren't driven by antibodies at all. Sepsis.
This is bacterial contamination of the blood component itself. The highest risk is actually from platelet transfusions. Red cells are refrigerated, which inhibits bacterial growth. But platelets must be stored at room temperature, making them a perfect, warm, nutrient-rich incubator for any stray bacteria. If you infuse a contaminated bag, the patient goes into immediate septic shock.
How does bacteria get into a sealed bag in the first place? And how do we stop it?
The bacteria usually comes from the donor's own skin flora during the needle stick. Sure. To prevent it, phlebotomists use rigorous aseptic scrubbing. But more importantly, modern collection bags use a diversion pouch. When the needle goes in, the first 30 to 45 milliliters of blood, which contains the tiny skin plug punched out by the needle, is diverted into a separate isolated side pouch. The actual collection bag only fills with the pristine blood that follows. We also routinely culture platelet units in the lab 24 hours after collection to guarantee they are sterile before release.
Another mechanical non-immune reaction is TACO, transfusion-associated circulatory overload.
This is purely a plumbing problem. You are pumping too much volume of dense fluid into the patient, or you're infusing it too fast. It primarily affects small children, the very elderly, or patients with compromised cardiac function whose hearts simply cannot pump the extra fluid load. The fluid backs up into the lungs, causing coughing, cyanosis, and pulmonary edema. The treatment is mechanical. Stops the transfusion, sit the patient upright, and administer diuretics to force them to urinate out the excess fluid.
And finally, for the acute non-immune category, simple non-immune hemolysis.
This is the physical destruction of the red cells by the hospital staff before the blood ever enters the patient. If you store the blood in a malfunctioning fridge that accidentally freezes it, the ice crystals act like knives and shred the cell membranes. If you heat it too aggressively in a faulty blood warmer, the proteins denature and the cells pop. Or if a nurse tries to push the thick blood through an IV needle that is too small, the sheer mechanical stress physically tears the cells apart.
Okay, that covers the immediate terrors. Now let's talk about the delayed transfusion reactions, the ones that happen days or weeks after the patient goes home. We already touched on the big one. Immunologic, hemolytic, extravascular.
Right. This is the anamnestic response we discussed with the Label kit antibodies. The patient was exposed years ago, the titer dropped, the lab cross-match was falsely compatible, 5 to 10 days after the new surgery, the IgG titer skyrockets. But because IgG is generally a poor complement activator, the cells don't violently explode in the veins. Instead, the donor red cells get heavily coated with IgG. As they circulate through the spleen and the liver, the macrophages of the immune system recognize the IgG tags and quietly pull the cells out of circulation, destroying them extravascularly.
So it's much milder than an ABO intravascular explosion.
Usually it is not life-threatening. The patient might feel fatigued, develop a mild fever, and exhibit mild jaundice as the bilirubin from the slowly degrading red cells builds up. The telltale sign for the doctor is that the patient's hemoglobin is steadily falling when it should be rising from the transfusion. The lab will run a DET, it will be strongly positive, and the newly awakened antibody will now show up brilliantly on a panel.
Then there's TAGVHD, transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. To me, this is the most horrifying biological concept on the list.
It is almost universally fatal, with a mortality rate exceeding 90%. This happens when a bag of donor blood contains viable, living donor T lymphocytes. These T cells survive the transfusion and establish themselves in the recipient's body. They look around, realize they are in a completely foreign genetic environment, and launch a massive, coordinated immune attack against the recipient's entire body. They attack the skin, the liver, the gut, and the bone marrow. Symptoms appear weeks later. A severe rash, intense diarrhea, and pancytopenia, a total failure of the bone marrow to produce any cells.
Why doesn't this happen to every single person who gets a transfusion? Why doesn't my body get overtaken by donor T cells?
Because a healthy immune system will instantly recognize those donor T cells as foreign invaders and slaughter them before they can establish a beachhead. But if the recipient is severely immunocompromised like premature infants, patients undergoing bone marrow transplants, or leukemia patients, they have no army to fight back. The donor T cells engraft unopposed.
But there's another massive risk factor that has nothing to do with being immunocompromised: blood donations from family members.
Yes, this is a cruel genetic trap. If you receive a directed donation from a first-degree relative like a parent or a sibling, your immune system shares so many HLA genetic markers that your body doesn't recognize the relative's T cells as foreign. Your immune system basically waves them through the checkpoint. But the donor T cells, being mature, recognize the minor differences in your body and launch the attack. For all these vulnerable populations, the prevention is absolute. We must irradiate the blood components with gamma radiation before transfusion. The radiation physically shatters the DNA of the donor T lymphocytes, rendering them unable to replicate an attack.
And the final delayed reaction is iron overload. Totally non-immune, just chemical accumulation.
Every single unit of packed red blood cells contains about 250 milligrams of iron. If you are a patient with a chronic anemia, like thalassemia or sickle cell anemia, you might require hundreds of transfusions over your lifetime to survive. The human body has no physiological mechanism to excrete excess iron. It just builds up. It deposits in the organs, causing cirrhosis of the liver, endocrine failure leading to diabetes, and ultimately fatal cardiomyopathy. The only way to save these patients is to rigorously monitor their serum ferritin levels and prescribe iron-chelating drugs, which chemically bind the iron and pull it out through the urine.
We are in the final stretch, part 7. The most vulnerable patients. We've talked extensively about adults, but what about the beginning of life? Testing neonates, which the blood bank rigidly defines as babies under 4 months old, has completely unique protocols.
It does, because a newborn is essentially an immunological blank slate. For a baby under 4 months, the lab only performs an ABO forward grouping. We test the red cells to see if they are A, B, or O. We absolutely do not perform a reverse grouping on a newborn.
Because they don't have their own antibodies yet.
Precisely. A newborn's immune system hasn't started manufacturing anti-A or anti-B. Any antibodies you find floating in the baby's plasma are actually maternal IgG antibodies that cross the placenta during pregnancy. So if you need to do an antibody screen to find an alone antibody, you can technically use the baby's serum, but standard practice is to draw the mother's blood and use her serum. It's a much larger volume, and since the threat originated from her immune system, her serum gives you the clearest picture of what is attacking the baby.
Which leads us directly into the ultimate maternal-fetal conflict. HDFN, hemolytic disease of the fetus and newborn. The sources explicitly compare the two major flavors of this disease: ABO HDFN versus RH HDFN. Let's break this down. ABO disease first.
ABO HDFN almost exclusively happens when the mother is Group O and the baby is Group A or Group B. We noted earlier that anti-A and anti-B are mostly giant IgM pentamers that can't cross the placenta. But Group O mothers have a unique quirk. They naturally produce a specialized IgG form of anti-A. Because it is IgG, it crosses the placental barrier effortlessly. Furthermore, because these antibodies are naturally occurring from environmental exposure, ABO disease can absolutely affect a woman's very first pregnancy.
But despite being so common, the severity is totally different from Rh disease.
It is incredibly common, but thankfully it is almost always very mild. The fetal red blood cells just don't have fully developed, structurally mature A or B antigens yet. They are sparse. So the maternal IgG crosses over, but it doesn't have many targets to latch onto. The attack is weak. Under the microscope, the baby's blood will show spherocyte cells that have had little bites taken out of them by macrophages. The data on the baby will be weak or even negative. You can't predict it during pregnancy, and you can't prevent it, but it's easily treated after birth with standard UV phototherapy to break down the bilirubin.
Contrast that mild common nuisance with the sheer terror of Rh-HDFN.
Rh disease is the classic, severe, historically devastating form of the disease. It happens when an Rh-negative mother is carrying an Rh-positive baby. Unlike ABO disease, it almost never affects the first child. The mother has to be sensitized first. She has to be exposed to the D antigen to build the IgG weapon. That exposure usually happens during the traumatic mixing of blood at the birth of that first Rh-positive child.
So she builds the anti-D army in the weeks after the first birth. The first baby is safe, but the second pregnancy becomes the target.
Exactly. When she gets pregnant with her second Rh-positive child, the memory B cells wake up. Her potent IgG anti-D crosses the placenta early in the pregnancy and aggressively, violently destroys the second baby's Rh-positive red cells as fast as the baby can make them. It causes massive fetal anemia. The baby's heart fails trying to pump the thin blood, leading to massive fluid accumulation and swelling known as hydrocephalus. Historically, this resulted in routine stillbirths. The DEET on the newborn, if it survives, will be violently positive.
But the triumph of mid-20th century medicine is that Rh disease is largely a thing of the past. It is entirely predictable and preventable.
Predictable because obstetricians routinely screen the mother's serum for anti-D at the beginning of her pregnancy. Preventable because brilliant scientists invented Rh immune globulin, or RAG, commercially known as Rogam.
Let's do a deep dive on the lab workup for RHIG, because this is where the lab tech really has to do some heavy lifting, high-stakes math. To evaluate a mother for an RAG injection postpartum, what are the strict criteria?
First, the mother must type as Rh negative. If she's Rh positive, she has the antigen, she won't make the antibody, she doesn't need the drug. Second, her IAT antibody screen must prove she has not already developed an active anti-DLO antibody. If she's already actively producing anti-D, the horse has left the barn. Giving her RAG won't do anything, she's permanently sensitized. Third, we test the baby's cord blood. The baby must type as Rh positive. If the baby is Rh negative, there was no incompatible antigen exposure during birth, so there was no risk to the mother.
Okay, so the scenario is set. She's Rh negative, baby is Rh positive, she's insensitized yet. We need to give her an injection of RHIG. This drug acts like a sponge. It mops up any stray fetal Rh positive cells that leaked into her bloodstream during the trauma of delivery before her immune system has a chance to notice them and memorize the threat. But a standard dose only covers a small bleed. If she had a massive hemorrhage during an emergency C-section, she needs a massive dose. How does the lab figure out exactly how much fetal blood is floating in her veins?
You start with a qualitative screening test on the mother's postpartum blood, called the Rosette test. You take a sample of the mother's blood, which is overwhelmingly her own Rh negative cells, but might contain a few hidden fetal Rh positive cells. You incubate that sample with reagent anti-D. The anti-D will find and coat those rare fetal cells. Then you add special indicator D-positive red cells. These indicator cells will magnetically stick to the other end of that anti-D antibody, forming a visible cluster rosette around the central fetal cell.
It's basically a search party. You drop flares to see if any fugitives are hiding in the forest. If you look under the microscope and see rosettes, it proves a significant fetal maternal hemorrhage occurred. What then?
The Rosette test just says, yes, a bleed happened. It doesn't tell you the volume. For that, you must perform a grueling, highly technical quantitative test, the Kleihauer-Bedke test.
The Kleihauer-Bedke, the KB test. This relies on an acid elution technique. How does it work physically?
It exploits a fundamental chemical difference between adult hemoglobin and fetal hemoglobin. You make a thin smear of the mother's blood on a glass slide. You expose that slide to a highly acidic buffer. Adult hemoglobin A, is highly sensitive to acid. It completely dissolves and washes out of the cell, leaving the mother's red cells looking like transparent pale ghosts. But fetal hemoglobin F is chemically resistant to acid.
It stays perfectly intact inside the fetal cells. You then flood the slide with a bright pink stain.
So the ghost cells don't pick up the stain because there's nothing left inside them.
Exactly. But the fetal cells, full of intact hemoglobin, light up bright, vibrant pink against a background of thousands of pale ghosts. The lab tech sits at the microscope and painstakingly counts 2,000 cells, keeping a strict tally of how many pink fetal cells they see versus how many maternal ghost cells. You plug that percentage into a complex formula based on the mother's total blood volume to calculate the exact milliliter volume of the fetal bleed.
I want to frame this for the listener. Imagine it is 3 a.m. A mother has just survived a harrowing, complicated delivery. She's exhausted, she is Rh negative, and the lab tech looking through that microscope holds the fate of her future children in their hands. They have to do the math to dose the RHIG perfectly. The standard rule is 1 standard dose, or 1 vial of RHIG, protects against 15 milliliters of D-positive fetal red blood cells, which is equivalent to 30 milliliters of fetal whole blood. Let's say the tech does the KB calculation and determines the mother needs 1.4 vials. What is the dosing rule?
The blood bank operates on a very specific, inflexible rounding rule designed to build an absolute safety buffer. We never, ever want to underdose the mother. First, you look at the decimal. If the decimal is less than 0.5, you round down to the whole number, and then you must add 1 full vial for safety. So 1.4 rounds down to 1, you add 1. The final mandatory dose sent to the floor is 2 vials.
What if it's a slightly larger bleed? The calculation comes out to 1.6 vials.
If the decimal is 0.5 or higher, you round up to the next whole number, and you still add 1 vial for the safety buffer. So 1.6 rounds up to 2. You add 1. The final dose is 3 vials.
You do the standard math rounding, and then you always add 1. It's a non-negotiable built-in insurance policy.
It has to be. If you underdose that mother by even a fraction of a milliliter, those leftover fetal cells will circulate, her immune system will find them, she will build anti-D, and her next pregnancy will be in severe jeopardy. The math has to be flawless.
We have covered an astronomical amount of ground today. To briefly summarize this entire journey for you listening, we started with the sheer architecture of the immune system, the bulky, slow, cold-loving IgM, and the sleek, rapid, body temperature IgG sniper. We learned how lab techs physically manipulate thermodynamics, ionic strength, and the literal electrical zeta potential of cells using fruit enzymes just to force invisible molecular battles into the light. We navigated the mysteries of ABO discrepancies, including the mind-blowing acquired B, where gut bacteria commit a biochemical heist to disguise a blood type. We profiled the dangerous rogue antibodies, the rigorous logic puzzles of the rule-out panel, the high stakes of cross-matching, the terrifying reality of intravascular transfusion reactions in DIC, and finally, the beautiful mathematical triumph of preventing hemolytic disease of the newborn.
It is a phenomenal synthesis of advanced immunology, physics, biochemistry, and acute clinical care. It is arguably the most rigorous diagnostic discipline in the hospital.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with a provocative thought to ponder. Given how incredibly complex and fraught human blood typing is, with all these rogue kid antibodies hiding from screens, acquired B bacterial tricks, delayed anamnestic reactions, and the constant lingering fear of a fatal ABO mismatch due to a clerical error, how close are we to completely bypassing this biological mess? Think about the development of universal, synthetically manufactured red blood cells. If we could bioengineer a functional red blood cell in a lab with absolutely zero surface antigens, no A, no B, no Rh, no Kel, no KID, just a smooth, perfect oxygen-carrying sphere, we wouldn't just be avoiding transfusion reactions, we would be rendering the entire century-old science of the blood bank totally obsolete. The test tubes, the AHG, the enzyme lawnmowers, the intense cross-matches, all of it, gone. Replaced by a single, universal, off-the-shelf product.
A fascinating prospect. It would be the ultimate resolution to the diagnostic muddy waters we've been swimming in. A true triumph of engineering over biology.
Something to think about next time you see a bag of blood hanging on an IV pole in a hospital room. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you can look at a simple test tube of blood with a newfound sense of awe, knowing the invisible wars, the genetic history, and the incredible chemical science happening right inside it. Until next time.